Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to this educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. Today we'll be studying Chapter 8, Types of Respiratory Systems. And this chapter is from the Form 4 Biology syllabus, the KSSM syllabus for biology. And the subtopic is 8.1, Part 1. So in this topic, we'll be studying gaseous exchange in amoeba, insects and fishes. The learning standards for today's lesson are as follows. Subtopic 8.1, Types of Respiratory Systems. After this lesson, we should be able to 1. Identify the respiratory structures in A. Insects, such as the grasshopper, B. Fish, C. Amphibians, such as the frog, and D. Humans. Number 2, we should be able to describe the adaptations of the respiratory structures and the functions for gaseous exchange in A. Animals, such as insects and fish, and B. Humans. So again, for this video, we'll concentrate on the adaptations of the respiratory structures in insects and fish. Number 3, compare and contrast the respiratory structures in humans and animals. This is not in this video, but in the next video, up and coming video. Now, first of all, what is the respiratory system of an organism? The definition of the respiratory system is that it is a biological system consisting of organs, tissues, and structures that help organisms to breathe, meaning to take in oxygen into the body from the environment, like for humans, breathing in the oxygen into the lungs, and discharging or expelling the carbon dioxide from the body into the environment. Okay, so the structure of the respiratory system. Depending on the organism, the respiratory system may include airways. For example, the trachea in humans allow air to flow into it and then flow through it. And then there will be respiratory organs, except for amoeba. Respiratory organs, for example, lungs in humans and gills in fishes. Now, in the respiratory organs, right, like lungs, there are the respiratory structures or surfaces. Now, this is the important part where gaseous exchange occurs. All right, and the respiratory structure in the lungs of humans is called the alveolus, plural alveoli, right? And for fishes, in the gills, there are the gill filaments that allow exchange of gases between the body and the surrounding environment. So blood vessels are used then to transport oxygen to the cells. After the oxygen has diffused through the respiratory structures, it will go into the blood vessels, and then blood will transport oxygen to the cells. All right? For example, surrounding the alveoli, there are lots of blood vessels to transport oxygen to the cells. Now, but in insects, blood is not involved to transport oxygen. We'll come to that later. So the functions of the respiratory system is that it takes in oxygen into the body from the surrounding air for humans, and for fishes from water, and it expels carbon dioxide into the environment. Then it carries out gaseous exchange, whereby oxygen diffuses through the respiratory structure or surface, for example, through alveoli, into the blood. Okay, and for insects, the oxygen diffuses directly into the cells without blood being involved. We'll come to that later. Now, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood or cells to be excreted into the environment. So oxygen is transported after it diffuses through the respiratory structure into the blood. It is transported by blood to cells for cellular respiration. Okay, that is for humans and also for fishes. Okay, so we'll come to that later. So insects don't have a blood circulatory system to transport oxygen for them. Now let's look at the first learning standard. Learning standard number 1. Identify respiratory structures in insects, fish, amphibians, and humans. Try and say this word, respiratory structure. This is an important keyword for this lesson. So what is the respiratory structure? Now, in the respiratory system of an organism, we have the respiratory organs. And in the respiratory organs are the respiratory structures. And on the respiratory structures are the respiratory surfaces, okay, which allow gaseous exchange to occur. So textbook defines it as such. The respiratory structure is the respiratory surface, or it contains the respiratory surface, okay, that enables gaseous exchange to occur between respiring cells of an organism and its outer environment. Okay, and gaseous exchange here is defined as the diffusion of oxygen into the organism's body and the diffusion of carbon dioxide out from the organism's body to be expelled to the environment. Right? So example is alveoli in humans. So here we see some alveoli. It consists of a respiratory surface here. All right. So the oxygen will diffuse from the space in the alveoli through the respiratory surface into the blood capillaries, and then the blood will transport the oxygen to the body cells, right? So let's look at the various respiratory systems and respiratory structures of different organisms. So in our syllabus, we have to know, we have to study the amoeba, insect, fish, frog, and humans, right? And for this video, we will discuss amoeba, insect, and fish. Now, the respiratory system of the amoeba, there's no respiratory system, so we just say the amoeba doesn't have a complex respiratory system. It just uses its plasma membrane as a respiratory structure. So oxygen will diffuse through the plasma membrane into the amoeba, into the cell of the amoeba. Okay, whereas carbon dioxide will diffuse out from the amoeba through the plasma membrane to the environment. So insects, such as grasshoppers, the respiratory system is called the tracheal system, and in the tracheal system we have the tiny tubes called the tracheals, which are the respiratory structures which allow oxygen to diffuse through them into the body cells. For fish, the respiratory system are the gills, and the respiratory structures in the respiratory system are the gill filaments and the lamellae, which are tiny projections that stick out from the gill filaments. For frogs, the respiratory system is called the skin and also includes the pulmonary system. That means the system that contains the lungs, right? Pulmonary has to do with lungs. And respiratory structures are the skin, lungs, and mouth lining that allow gaseous exchange to occur. For humans, our respiratory system is simply called the human respiratory system, and the respiratory structures are the alveoli in the lungs. Singular form is alveolus. So for this syllabus, for this video, we'll be studying number 1, 2, and 3, amoeba, insect, and fish, right? Let us first discuss gaseous exchange in a unicellular organism, that is, amoeba species. Firstly, how does gaseous exchange occur in amoeba species? Now, we've studied a bit about that in chapter 2 of the Form 4 syllabus. So, firstly, we must explain that the concentration of oxygen is higher in the environment than in the cell, because the oxygen within the cell is used in the process of cellular respiration. It's constantly used for cellular respiration. Thus, oxygen diffuses from the environment down the concentration gradient into the cell through the plasma membrane, which is the respiratory surface or structure. On the other hand, for carbon dioxide, the concentration of carbon dioxide is always higher in the cell than in the environment, because carbon dioxide is produced through cellular respiration. Thus, carbon dioxide diffuses from the cell into the environment down the concentration gradient through the plasma membrane too. Okay, that is gaseous exchange in amoeba. Now we come to the question, explain why amoeba species does not require a specialized respiratory structure for exchange of gases. 4 marks. This can be asked as a structured question. So, why does amoeba not require any specialized respiratory structure? It just depends on the plasma membrane for gaseous exchange, right? So why does it require a specialized respiratory structure like the lungs in humans, or sorry, like the alveoli in the lungs for humans, or the gill filaments for fishes? So why doesn't it have any specialized respiratory structure? It just depends on its plasma membrane for diffusion of gases. Now the reason is because amoeba is small, very small, and because of that it has a large TSA per V ratio, which is the total surface area to volume ratio. All right, this means that the large TSA per V ratio means that the TSA, or total surface area, is comparatively large compared to the volume. All right, and the diffusion of gases occur quickly through the thin plasma membrane because of its large total surface area of the plasma membrane. All right, the larger the total surface area of the surface, like the plasma membrane, the surface of the organism, then the faster the diffusion of gases through it. Okay, and the diffusion occurs quickly enough to supply the oxygen to the cells and to excrete the carbon dioxide from the cells. Okay, and it is enough to supply the oxygen for all the cells' needs. All right, because its volume, okay, is comparatively small, meaning to say that the demand or the requirement for oxygen is not that high. Okay, the demand for oxygen is not that high because the V is small in comparison to the TSA. Thus, it doesn't need that much oxygen, and the diffusion is enough to supply oxygen to the cell for its needs. All right, and to excrete the carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of respiration. Thus, no specialized respiratory structure is needed to increase the total surface area anymore. All right, and to increase the rate of diffusion of gases. Right. Now, just now we said that since amoeba has a small size, its TSA per V ratio is large, okay, larger compared to a big organism. So let's prove this by using cubes to represent the organisms. And then we're going to calculate the TSA per V ratio of the small cube and the bigger cube to see whether there is a difference in the TSA per V ratio as the cube size becomes bigger. Okay, so if the length of the cube is 1 cm, okay, 1 by 1 by 1, what is its total surface area? Okay, so take one face here, right? So one face has the surface area of 1 times 1, which is equals to 1, and then there are 6 faces, so you have to times by 6 and you get 6. Volume is length cube, so it will be 1 times 1 times 1, it will be 1. TSA per V ratio is take this total surface area divided by 1, which is the volume, you get 6. Now, similarly for the cube with length 2 cm, okay, one face of the cube will have an area of 2 times 2 equals to 4, but there are 6 faces, so it will be 24 cm squared. That's the total surface area. Volume equals to L cube, length cube will be, which will be 2 cube, which is 8. TSA per V ratio is 24 divided by 8. You can see that the ratio becomes 3. And as we continue to calculate the TSA per V ratio for even larger cubes, like a cube with a length 3 cm, 4 cm, and so forth, you see that this ratio becomes smaller and smaller. Okay, the reason being that the TSA, all right, increases as length squared, but V increases as length cube. So V will increase faster. Then therefore this ratio will become smaller as the cube becomes bigger, right? So this, what's the implication from this, right? Now let's look at the conclusion here. The bigger the organism, the smaller the TSA per V ratio, and the lower the rate of diffusion of oxygen across its surface to all body cells. So when, as we have mentioned just now, when the TSA per V ratio becomes smaller, right, the relative rate of diffusion of oxygen through through the surface of the organism will become lower, in the sense that it cannot supply enough oxygen through diffusion through the surface of the body for the organism's need for oxygen. Okay, so we have discussed that earlier, and this calculation is just to prove that as the TSA per V, as the size of organism increases, the TSA per V ratio will decrease. And that's why larger organisms need a specialized respiratory structure for gaseous exchange. Let us now answer a second important question. Explain why larger organisms require a special respiratory structure with large surface area for the efficient exchange of gases. 5 marks. So it all boils down to the TSA per V ratio, right? The total surface area to volume ratio, or TSA per V ratio, of an organism depends on its size. The bigger the organism, the smaller the total surface area to volume ratio. This is the relationship. It's like an inversely proportional relationship. The size of the organism is inversely proportional to its TSA per V ratio. Okay? So the bigger the organism, the smaller the TSA per V ratio. And the reason, now the reason may not need to be written down, but it's just for us to understand. In the answer, you may not need to write the reason. For a large complex organism, the volume of its body that requires oxygen increases more, or is relatively bigger, than its total surface area through which diffusion of oxygen occurs. If you compare a large organism with a small organism, like amoeba, right? The large complex organism will have a bigger volume of body, and that determines or causes more oxygen to be required, much more oxygen to be required for cellular respiration, okay, of the cells. And then its total surface area through which diffusion of oxygen occurs. So the total surface area will determine how fast diffusion of oxygen occurs. Okay, if diffusion of oxygen occurs through the surface of the organism, right? The bigger the surface area, then the faster the diffusion of oxygen. However, as the size of the organism increases, we find that volume increases as x cubed, but surface area increases only as x squared for a cube. For example, for a cube. So as we have said just now, the TSA increases more slowly than the V, or volume, all right, as the size of the organism increases. Thus, on the whole, this will cause the TSA per V ratio to become smaller as the size of the organism increases. So, large complex organisms cannot carry out gaseous exchange by diffusion through the body surface only. Diffusion of oxygen through the relatively smaller outer surface of the body would occur too slowly to meet the high demands of the body for oxygen. Okay, so diffusion of oxygen can occur through outer surface of body, maybe, but it will not meet the high demands of the body for oxygen. It may supply oxygen to certain cells only, and then some cells will not be able to get the oxygen in time for cellular respiration. So if the organism would not get enough oxygen for its cells' needs, then it can die due to lack of oxygen for cellular respiration. Thus, it must increase its total surface area for gaseous exchange, so that more oxygen can diffuse into the body and then be transported to the cells. Thus, a large organism requires a special respiratory structure with a large surface area for efficient exchange of gases. And for example, lungs of animals, such as humans, have many internal folds. For example, in humans, it forms the lungs have the alveoli or air sacs, which help to increase the surface area of the lungs, total surface area of the lungs for efficient gaseous exchange. Now, how do organisms increase the total surface area of their respiratory structures for faster gaseous exchange? So, some organisms have folded lining of lungs to provide larger surface area for faster diffusion of gases through the surface. For example, the frog's lungs. A frog doesn't have any alveoli, right, or air sacs, but it has this folded lining inside its lungs to increase its total surface area for faster gaseous exchange. Now, humans are more advanced than frogs, so their respiratory structures are more complex, and we have to be thankful that we have these alveoli, which are tiny air sacs, all right, grouped together like grapes, bundles of grapes. And do you know that a pair of human lungs contain about 700 million alveoli, right? Producing 70 meters squared of surface area. Think of a field that is 7 by 10 meter squared. 7 by 10. 7 meters by 10 meters. Right? That's a very big field. And that is the surface area of, total surface area of all the alveoli in our lungs. Okay? For faster gaseous exchange. Each alveolus is wrapped in a fine network of blood capillaries covering about 70% of the area. So outside this alveolus, outside this bundle of alveoli, we have blood capillaries, okay, to receive the oxygen that is diffused through the alveolus and then send it to the blood will send it to the body cells for cellular respiration. Here's an important learning standard and question for SPM. Learning Standard 2. Describe the adaptations of the respiratory structures and their functions for gaseous exchange in animals. 8 marks. Adaptations of respiratory structures and their functions. Or, put in another way for essay questions, how are the respiratory structures of large-sized organisms adapted for efficient exchange of gases? 8 marks. Okay, so this is an important SPM question that comes out frequently, quite often in the exam. So we must remember and be able to understand and also explain it. So memorize this. Adaptations of respiratory structures in large organisms for efficient exchange of gases include the following points. Firstly, the respiratory structures are numerous and have a large total surface area to volume ratio, TSA per V ratio, for efficient exchange of respiratory gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, for example, if we take the human lungs, the lungs have a lot of these alveoli, which are the respiratory structures. So they are numerous. The alveoli are numerous, or there's a large number of alveoli to provide a large total surface area. All right, this surface area here, if you add up all the surface area of all the millions of alveoli, it is very big. For efficient exchange of respiratory gases, because the diffusion of the gases will occur more quickly through the larger total surface area. All right, for example, oxygen will diffuse from the alveolus through the wall of the alveolus into the blood, through the surface here. Okay, so, and carbon dioxide will diffuse out and then into the alveolus, from the blood into the alveolus, right, here. So the larger the total surface area, the faster the diffusion of oxygen into the blood, as an example, and the more efficient the exchange of respiratory gases. Secondly, the surface of the respiratory structure is always moist. As you can see here, there's a thin layer of moisture in the inner surface of the alveolus, okay, to dissolve the respiratory gases. For example, oxygen has to dissolve in this layer of moisture first before it can diffuse through and then diffuse into the blood capillaries. Okay, so third point, the respiratory structure has a thin wall that is 1 cell thick for quick diffusion of respiratory gases. As seen here, for humans, the alveolus has a thin wall that is only 1 cell thick, so that the diffusion of oxygen through it can occur quickly into the blood capillaries, right? And then fourthly, the respiratory structure has a dense network of blood capillaries. For example, there are blood capillaries surrounding the alveolus to transport, for efficient transport of respiratory gases, for example, oxygen to the cells, right? And also for efficient transport of carbon dioxide from the cells to the alveoli. All right. So except for insects. Insects don't rely on blood capillaries to transport oxygen, for example. So here I have a memory aid called TsaV to help you remember the 4 points, right? And SA stands for surface area, M for moist, the respiratory structure is always moist, T for thin, the wall of the respiratory structure is always thin, and B for blood capillaries. Okay, the respiratory structure is a dense network of blood capillaries. Also take note that for each explanation, you have the first part and the second part. The first part, for example, respiratory structures are numerous and have large TSA per V ratio. This is the fact or the adaptation, okay, the feature, the characteristic. And then after the arrow, we have the explanation. What's the function of it? What's the function of that characteristic? Okay, so fact leading to explanation. But in the exam, you don't write the arrow. Okay, here it's just to show you that there are 2 parts to the answer. If you only write one part, you will not get the marks. So you must write both the fact and the explanation. Okay. Here is a summary of what we have discussed in the previous slide. 4 adaptations of respiratory structures or surfaces for efficient gaseous exchange, right? Using the biokey TsaV. Number 1, large surface area to volume ratio for efficient exchange of respiratory gases, as seen in the picture here. And number 2, moist, the respiratory structures are moist to dissolve the respiratory gases, okay, as seen in this part here, in this alveolus with the layer of moisture inside its inner surface. Number 3, walls, thin walls or membranes 1 cell thick for faster diffusion of respiratory gases. Okay, so for example, in the alveolus has a wall that's only 1 cell thick, thin wall for faster diffusion of respiratory gases. And number 4, a lot of blood capillaries surrounding the respiratory structures for efficient transport of respiratory gases. So copy this down in your note book, and it's very useful to remember the biokey, TsaV. Now let us discuss the respiratory systems of 2 organisms. Firstly, insects, and secondly, fish. So in insects, the respiratory system is called the tracheal system, from the word trachea. Okay, the trachea is the tube which allows the flow of gases in it. So the respiratory structure in the tracheal system are the tracheals, which are these tiny tubes that branch out from the trachea, which is the main tube. Pathway of air is, now imagine that this is the respiratory system of the insect. It looks like a hand, all right, sticking out like that with its fingers. So these are spiracles here. There are spiracles here, or pores or openings that allow the gases to move in or out. So for example, oxygen. The air with oxygen enters the spiracles or pores, and then it flows through the trachea, which is an air tube, and then the trachea branches out to form tracheals. So the gas will flow into the tracheals, and at the tips of the tracheals there is some fluid to allow the oxygen gas to dissolve in the fluid, so that it can diffuse quickly through the tracheals directly into the body cells. So that is the flow of oxygen or air into the tracheals and to the cells. Let us now look at the overall view of the tracheal system. So this is the dorsal view of the insect, showing you the tracheal system in the insect, okay, which is the respiratory system of the insects. So this is a grasshopper, and here we can see the red lines here represent the tracheal system. The black branches here are the tracheals, which branch out from the trachea. All right. So we start with the spiracles here, which are the small pores in the thorax and abdomen, right? And the function of the spiracles is to allow the intake of air into the trachea from the environment. So the spiracles are found on both sides of the body of the insect, right? So in each segment there is a pair of spiracles, in each segment of the the abdomen, for example, there's a pair of spiracles to allow air to flow into the tracheal system. Then the trachea is a network of air tubes, shown here in red, in the insect's body, and it extends to many parts of the body to allow the flow of air that contains oxygen to the cells. It also allows the flow of air containing carbon dioxide out into the environment, from the cells to the environment, okay, to excrete the carbon dioxide. So this is a close-up view of just one part here of the tracheal system, showing you one trachea, but there are many trachea in the grasshopper. So let's just have a look at one. Here we can see the spiracles, and then on the trachea, which is the air tube, we can see a lot of chitin rings. So chitin is a hard substance found in insects, and it helps to support the trachea here so that it will not collapse. All right, it will not close up or bend over or be folded up, especially during the breathing mechanism. When the breathing mechanism is being carried out, the air pressure will change. And to prevent the collapse of the trachea, the chitin rings will hold up the trachea, okay, and keep it open during the movements so air can flow, right? So chitin ring is for support of trachea. Then the trachea branches out to form tracheals, which are finer tubes branching out from trachea. And the tracheal is actually the respiratory structure containing the respiratory surfaces here that function in gaseous exchange directly with the cells. Okay, so there's no blood or fluid that transports the oxygen to the cells. The tracheal is in direct contact. The tracheals are all in direct contact with the body cells to deliver the oxygen directly to the body cells. Okay, so that's why the tracheal is called the respiratory structure, and there are numerous tracheal inside the grasshopper and the insects to deliver or transport or allow the oxygen to diffuse into the cells, into every cell. Okay, now the tracheal does not contain the chitin ring, so chitin ring is only found on trachea. Then lastly, we have the air sacs, which are not shown here, but they are shown here. All right, so the yellow structures here are the air sacs, and they are just at the side of the trachea. So their function is that they contain air when the abdominal muscles, for example, when the abdominal muscles contract, this air will then be pushed out from the air sacs, and it can help to speed up delivery of respiratory gases, right, to the body cells during movement, right? So there are many air sacs on the trachea, So air sacs are found in grasshoppers and some of the insects, but not in all. Now this diagram here shows us the side view of the grasshopper. Here we can see there are lots of air sacs, okay, on the segments of the abdomen, okay, abdominal region, that are attached to the tracheal system, okay. And then just now we have seen this structure already here, and you can copy this enlarged diagram of the tracheal system in insects. All right, you must know how to label the parts and then all the functions, right? So this is the spiracle, which allows air to move into the trachea, and then chitin rings help to support the trachea and prevent it from collapsing and keeps the trachea open. So air will diffuse, will flow in, all right, from the atmosphere through the trachea and then to the tracheals, which are the respiratory structures. And then the oxygen, for example, the oxygen will dissolve in the fluid-filled tips here of the tracheals. So after that, oxygen will diffuse quickly into the body cells, directly into the body cells. So you can copy this diagram and also copy the table which shows you the parts and the functions that is in the previous slide. Let us now discuss the adaptations of the tracheal system for efficient gaseous exchange. So this is important for the exam. Comes out as a structured question or essay question. Number one, the large number of tracheals. all right, the tracheals here. There are numerous tracheals to provide a large total surface area for faster exchange of gases. Secondly, the tracheals have moist walls, especially at the tips here, to allow the respiratory gases to dissolve and diffuse quickly through it. For example, for oxygen, it will diffuse quickly through the wall of the tracheals into the body cells, whereas carbon dioxide will diffuse out. From the cells, it will diffuse into the tracheals. All right. Now, tracheals have thin walls. Okay, this wall here of the tracheal is very thin, to allow the oxygen gas to diffuse quickly into the cells, right, and carbon dioxide to diffuse out from the cells here into the tracheals. So these three adaptations can be summarized and written in a short form. SA for surface area, large surface area. Okay, M is for moist, and then T is for thin walls. So SAM-T. The full bio key is SAM-TB, but for insects, blood is not involved in the transport of oxygen. So it has three adaptations here only. Okay, SAM-T instead of SAM-TB. So memorize these adaptations. Right, other than insects, we have to know the respiratory system of fishes. So let us discuss and discover the structures in the respiratory system of fishes. The respiratory system of the fish is the gills. So we can buy a fish from the market and then wash it, clean it, and then cut open the operculum, which is the gill cover, okay, on each side of the fish head. And the operculum opens up at this end here, so we can pull it open and cut off the operculum. Then inside we can see that there are red structures, and these are called the gills. They are rich in blood supply, so they are red in color. There are 4 gills on each side of the fish's head, right? And we can also see these structures sticking out, which look like thorns. Okay, these are called the gill rakers. We'll discuss them later. So the respiratory system of the fish is the gills, and the respiratory structure is called the gill filaments. Okay, so here you can see tiny lines on the gills. These are the gill filaments, all right, which we will discuss later. Now, what is the pathway of water in the fish? So when the fish opens its mouth and lowers its the floor of the buccal cavity, the buccal cavity is actually the mouth area here. So when it lowers the floor of the buccal cavity, the water will go into the fish, and then it will flow through the gills, gill filaments here. The lines here are the, represent the gill filaments, and lamellae, which cannot be seen here, and then it flow out of the operculum, right? Now when it flows past the gills, then the oxygen will diffuse into the blood, right, in the blood capillaries here, and carbon dioxide will diffuse out from the blood into the water. Okay, so the water that flows out will contain less oxygen and more carbon dioxide. Okay, so in through the mouth, out through the operculum. That's the flow of water. Now let's discuss the structure of the respiratory system. Now let us discuss the respiratory system of the fish. So the fish has a gill cover that covers its gills, all right? And this gill cover is called the operculum. Its function is to protect the gills from damage. So if we cut away this operculum, we will see the gills, the red gills inside the fish head, all right, the fish's head. So the gills, so this is the structure of the gills, and it is made up of 3 parts. The first part are the red structures called the gill filaments. There are numerous gill filaments, all right, which are the respiratory structures used for gaseous exchange in the fish. And these gill filaments have projections on them called lamella. Plural form is lamellae, all right? So here it cannot be seen, but it projects out like, 90 degrees from the gill filaments here, right, from each gill filament. So there are thin flat projections on the gill filaments here, and they are to provide a large total surface area. So they help to increase the total surface area of the gill filaments for more efficient gaseous exchange, right, with the water. Then the gill filaments are supported by a bony structure called the gill arch, here, the white part here. So then on the gill arch, there are many gill rakers, all right, which are projections that stick out like this, right? So when the water flows through into the mouth and out past the gills here, the water may contain sand particles that may damage the gills. So these gill rakers help to filter the sand particles from the water and prevent damage to the gills. Okay. So next, let us look at the structure, the gill filaments in more detail. Now you can copy the notes in the table here, right? So this set of pictures shows us systematically the structure of the gills, the gill filaments, and the lamellae, from the bigger structures to the smaller structures. Now, as we have discussed just now, a fish gill comprises gill raker, gill arch, and a row of gill filaments. So if you look from the top or from the bottom, we'll see that the gill filaments actually have two projections sticking out. And this is the part of the gill arch. So let's just take out a section of this and look at the enlarged version. Now we can see two blood vessels in the gill arch here. The blue one represents the blood vessel carrying deoxygenated blood to the gill filaments. So it flows downwards to the gill and then flows horizontally into the gill filaments. Then the gill filaments will then allow oxygen to diffuse into the blood vessels in it, and then oxygenated blood will flow out of the gill filaments this way and to the cells, body cells, okay, to deliver the oxygen to the body cells. So if you look from the top, this is the structure of one gill filament from the top. Okay, this is the gill raker, gill arch, and then the two blood vessels. And then the blood vessels, there's a system of blood vessels and a network of blood capillaries inside the gill filaments, okay, that allow oxygen to diffuse from water into them and for carbon dioxide to diffuse out from the blood into the water. So that's why the gill filaments are red in color, because they contain a dense network of blood capillaries. So if we were to enlarge one part of the gill filament, we will see that it contains tiny projections called lamellae that stick out from the gill filaments to further increase the total surface area for faster exchange of gases, right? Now, so let's just take one gill filament and turn it 90 degrees and then look at the enlarged version here. So we have to know how to label these parts. So gill raker, gill arch, and then in here these are the blood vessels, the bigger blood vessels. So, and then the blood capillaries are found in gill filaments, all right? So each projection here is a gill filament. Now let's look at one gill filament, one side of it. So blood, how is the blood flow in the gill filament? Now, deoxygenated blood will flow downwards this way in the gill filaments, and it also flows sideways in the lamella, right? So as the blood is flowing through the lamella, oxygen from the water will diffuse into the blood. So after oxygen has diffused into the blood will become oxygenated blood, okay, a red color blood vessel here. And this oxygenated blood will flow out of the gill filaments and to the body cells, okay, to deliver the oxygen to the body cells. All right, so now let's look at one enlarged part of this gill filament. Then we can see that the gill filament has a lot of lamella sticking out at right angles from it. So in each lamella, there is a network of blood capillaries. So at first, you see the blood is flowing through here, and it is deoxygenated blood, as denoted by the blue color. So the blood will flow in this direction, from right to left, okay, in the lamella. But the water flow is in the opposite direction, from left to right. So as the water flows past the lamella, oxygen will diffuse into the blood capillaries, right? So the blood becomes oxygenated blood, so it's colored red here. Then the oxygenated blood will flow through this bigger blood vessel from the lamella, then to this bigger blood vessel, and then out of the filaments, okay, out of the gills, out of the filaments, out of the gills to the body cells for cellular respiration. So the shape is like a H. You can see here, blood flows down and sideways, and then blood flows up and then out of the gill filaments. So we need to be able to label diagram number 1, 3, and 4. These are the important diagrams. Lastly, let's look at the adaptations of fish gills and filaments for efficient gaseous exchange. Also an important SPM question, right? So firstly, each filament has many thin flat projections called lamellae. Then the large number of filaments and the lamellae provides a large total surface area for efficient gaseous exchange. Okay, as we can see here, each gill contains many tiny filaments, and on each tiny filament there are more projections, which are the lamellae, to help increase the total surface area for faster gaseous exchange. Okay, so next, number 2, the lamella membrane is thin. All right, the membrane here between the blood capillaries and the environment. It is very thin for easy and faster diffusion of oxygen from the water into the blood capillaries, right? Thirdly, the lamellae are supplied with many blood capillaries, as we can see here, for efficient transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the oxygen from the water will diffuse into the blood capillaries, and after that the blood capillaries will carry this oxygen to the body cells, right? So that's why there are many blood capillaries for efficient transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, the carbon dioxide will be transported to the water here, okay, and it will diffuse out from the blood capillaries into the water. Okay, right. So remember the bio key SATB or SAM. Now the M stands for moist, but since the fish already lives in water, it does not need to have a special moist layer in the filaments here. Okay, at the filaments here. But anyway, if you write it in, if you're not sure, you just write it in. Okay, so for this acronym, we leave out the M, okay, like what the textbook has done. But okay, so it will be SATB, SATB. Right, that's all for this lesson. And do share, like, and subscribe. I hope that you've learned something from this. Till we meet again, goodbye.